Good afternoon. I extend a very warm welcome to all those who are present for this talk on. It's titled as "Crooked Cats: Beastly Tales from India," and the focus of today's lecture, I believe, is on uh, the changing ecological balance um, in a certain part of India and the human-animal interaction within that balance and the kind of challenges and problems and issues it throws up. And this is an area of, very important area for researchers because so much is unknown, as I believe she is going to talk about today. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Nayanika Mathur, who will be delivering this lecture today. She is an anthropologist, currently associate professor at the University of Oxford. Uh, her formal designation there is associate professor of anthropology and South Asian studies. So I extend a very warm welcome to her, and I welcome all members of the audience for their participation. And without further delay, I would like to invite her to deliver her lecture. Um, you'll speak for about 40-45 minutes,
Yeah,
followed by Q&As.
yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mishra, for the introduction and the invitation. Thank you also to Dr. Bhandari for making this happen and to everyone at NMML. Is it okay if we have the slides up there? Because what I'm going to do today is I'm going to be talking about my new book, which has just actually been released in India 2 days back. And as we sort of previously discussed, what I'm going to try to do today is just themes in the book um, and lay out what I think are some of the kinds of interventions I want to make with this work. So instead of going into a particular chapter and having more detailed discussion on one particular aspect of the book, I actually want to just discuss the broad arguments of the work. I am an anthropologist, as Dr. Mishra said, and this is a work which comes from the discipline of anthropology to a large extent. But what I'm also trying to do in this book are two things. One is actually speak to other disciplines, so whether this is history or politics, and also climate science and talk to geologists, etc. And the other thing I'm trying to do here, I don't know how successful I am with that, but I'm also trying to make this a kind of a crossover book, much more so than my previous work in terms of hopefully being able to, people who are not necessarily academic why I've written this book. I think I'm going to begin by talking about sort of the story that led to me getting interested in big cats, particularly in big cats that make prey of humans. These are popularly known as man-eaters. I refer to them as crooked cats, which is the title of my book as well. And hopefully, over the course of this talk, you will understand why I do not like the term man-eater, and I prefer to term them crooked cats, and what this title might be doing. So let me sort of begin with where this began. This actually began 15 years back when I was doing my PhD fieldwork in Uttarakhand. At the time, I was interested in understanding ethnography of state, of bureaucracy. I was interested in paperwork and laws and processes like that. I was a PhD student, and I was living in the district of Chamoli, and I was living in a small town called Gopeshwar, which is the district headquarters of Chamoli. Now, in 2006, at this point, I was really not interested in human non-human relations. I wasn't even particularly interested in climate or environmental studies. I was interested in very different questions around politics and the nature of the state, and how we can understand the state through an ethnographic perspective. While I was living in Gopeshwar, pretty much in the first month of my fieldwork back in, as I said, back in 2006, the winter of 2006, this man-eating leopard turned up in this town that I was living in. And she went on to spread what was popularly described as a reign of terror in the town. And we all sort of she was there for about 3 months, killed about 7 people, attacked many more humans, injured a lot of people. Um, and we were just, living in this really horrible state of fear constantly of encountering this big cat. Anyway, at that time, I did write about that particular leopard. She was eventually hunted down by a local hunter, and her sort of body was paraded on a jeep around the town as a sign that she's actually been killed. At the time, I did write about it, and actually the title of my book, my first book, Paper Tiger, comes from this period of living with this big cat. Um, and I found the term paper tiger useful because it helped me understand something about the nature of the Indian state, of the developmental state, and of welfare politics. Um, at the time that this leopard was operating in Gopeshwar, people would constantly say that, um, and I would ask very naive questions as one does when you're a PhD student and you're doing your field work for the first time, that, but why is no one doing anything? And what is the state doing, etc. And people would say, but, why are you surprised by this? Don't you understand that the Indian state is just a bag on kagaz, kagazi bag hai aur kuch nahi hai? And why are you sort of surprised by this? And this is where the title of my book comes from. But also the final chapter where I talk about the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, and I talk about the ways in which the local bureaucracy struggled to execute, to sort of function under the sort of the draconian nature of this legal assemblage. But at that time, I thought this is it. My book came out in 2015, 2016, and I thought this is it. I'm sort of done with big cats. I can sort of move on to other things that I was interested in. Actually, again, interested in questions of governance and the turn to the digital, etc. So more, in my understanding, more sort of conventional understandings of the state of politics, of anthropology, of South Asian studies. So I went back in 2015 during a postdoc for an extended period of fieldwork, again in Uttarakhand. But this time I was living in the town of Dehradun, which is, as you all know, the capital of Uttarakhand. And I was living in my parents' house, and doing some sort of initial field work in that area, just trying to talk to some people, etc. And just down the road from where I was living, at the Forest Research Institute, which again I'm sure many of you know, there was sort of this uncanny mirroring of something that had happened to me when I had started my doctoral field work, which is back in 2006. A leopard came and killed a young woman who was living in FRI at the time, and the way in which it happened was again very similar to what had happened back in Gopeshwar almost a decade back, where it was again in daylight. This young girl was attacked. In Gopeshwar, that first attack which had happened, that woman had not died, but she had very, very horrific sort of wounds on her face. And she was my neighbor, so I kind of knew her a bit, the first attack in Gopeshwar. She did survive, but it was horrific, the whole thing. In this case, this young girl died, and there was another attack on her child nearby. Also, what you're seeing now in Dehradun, again, I'm sure many of you know this, so I don't need to necessarily talk about it to all of you, is that there is an increasing presence of leopards in the villages that you can see around the city, or even in the city itself, right? So we see this in the news. We see this happening in ways that are actually part of popular consciousness in ways that they were not back in 2006, where you have big cats entering urban areas more and more. And my book is not about why this is happening or why that's not happening. I'm interested in that as a particular kind of phenomenon, which I then use to think about other aspects, which I will just come to. But anyway, so then in 2015, this happened, and I dropped my other project, which was actually on digital governance, and I was just interested in understanding the nature of the Indian. And I went back to study big cats, and I got more and more interested in them. And so what you have here with this particular book, so this is how Crooked Cats in the End happened. What you have, this is the India cover, which has just come out 2 days back, as I said. Finally, it's available in South Asia. So I'm really keen to know what people in India actually make of it, because so far, the only people who sort of read it are not in the region and don't necessarily know the reality of this in the same way as, yeah. But anyway, so let me talk about now about what I want to do with this book. And that's what I'm going to basically talk about for the next 20, 25 minutes. I'm going to just run through some of the major objectives of this work. And these objectives are partly sort of empirical in terms of thinking about the ways in which our relations with big cats are changing. But they're also methodological in terms of what does it mean. I'm very interested in this question of what it means to make knowledge in this moment in time when the climate crisis is so real. Again, I don't need to explain it to any of you here with the heat waves and the rains and everything that's sort of going on here. And all of you, of course, know about the disasters in Uttarakhand, the Chamoli disaster last year, as well as the ones before that. So I don't even need to explain all that to any of you. But I'm getting more and more interested in this question of what it means to produce academic knowledge in this moment. And again, as Dr. Mishra said, I teach in a South Asian studies program. Some of my students are here, which is wonderful to see. So I'm also very interested in thinking about how you teach across disciplines and the region in some way. So let me sort of finally get on to what this book is really about. And I'm going to be quite brief here because I hope we can make this more of a interaction. And I'm just going to drop the kinds of arguments I want to make here rather than going into details of any of them. So one of the things I want to do with this book is that I want to move away from two dominant modes of telling the story of predatory big cats, right? This is a story of man-eaters, which of course is most famously set out by Jim Corbett, and Jim Corbett figures largely in this book, not in particular ways that I'll just explain in a minute, but not just Jim Corbett, the whole figure of the white colonial hunter, but also after that, the post-colonial shikari, the masculinity that's around it. The narrative arc, there is a way in which you tell the story through the figure of the colonial hunter who continues to overwhelm this story in a way. And I want to move away from that. But the other story that is there is that of conservationism. And I will quickly explain in a minute why I want to move away from that too. But what the point I want to make here is that what I want Crooked Cats hopefully to do, and again, as I said, I'd be very curious to know whether I'm at all successful in doing this, is that I actually want to move away from these two dominant modes of describing man-eaters, which is through the Shikar Journal, through charismatic white hunters like Jim Corbett, and the other is through, say, like what the World Wildlife Fund tells us, what conservationist organizations tell us, the ways in which the Wildlife Protection Act continues to talk about it. So those are the two things I want to move away from. So what do I want to do? I want to actually center storytelling. I want to actually center how we tell particular kinds of stories. And here the story I want to talk about is about are humans changing relations with the world beyond, with non-humans, particularly with big cats. But actually, I was just talking to someone yesterday who was saying you'll never go away from what your first PhD fieldwork is about. And in a way, this book is also so much about bureaucracy and so much about governance and international regimes of governance, but also local governance regimes in India. And so I want to think about how do we tell the story in a way that is not just is sequestered within my discipline or sequestered within a particular sub-discipline, which is multi-species ethnography, but actually hopefully becomes of interest to others in other disciplines as well as outside, is the thing. And for this, I use this thing called Beastly Tales, which again, I'll just sort of describe a bit. Of course, it's taken with much gratitude from Vikram Seth's book of poetry, also with the same name. The other sort of aspects of this, which I'll describe in more detail as we sort of come to the slides, is really linked to the climate crisis in different ways. And this question of how do we write the climate crisis into our academic writing? How does it sort of figure in the work in which we're now producing? I feel this as much as a moral imperative as actually a quote unquote academic endeavor, because this question really comes from my long-standing work in Uttarakhand, which I don't think we can think about or write about the Upper Himalaya anymore outside the climate crisis. I use the Anthropocene as a frame. I will explain what I mean by the Anthropocene and how I use it subsequently. And then these are the other four themes which are sort of very central to it. One is the theme of uncertainty. So what does it mean to live in this time where we can, I think, no longer claim to have certain knowledge about the world we live in, but also about what the future might be, what the present is. And that's the theme that comes up in this book in every chapter. It sort of throbs with this idea of this uncertainty that we now face, whether this is political or ecological uncertainty. And I'm interested in questions of governance, as I said, but I'm interested in what happens when the governance that we're talking about is not directed at humans, but at the non-human world. I'm of course talking about charismatic megafauna here, but I also in this include things like forests and rivers and mountains and glaciers, etc. And what does it mean to govern the non-human world? I'm also interested in this question of beastly intimacy, by which I mean how do humans come to have intimate relations with the non-human world, and especially something like a tiger. So what does it mean to know what a tiger or a leopard is? And I want to explore all of this through the use of ethnography as a method, but particularly through the use of stories and storytelling as the ethnographic method through which I work. So this is sort of the thing. I'm going to go through all the points in a bit more detail now, just for the next sort of 20 minutes. Now, as I said, of course, the figure of Cobbett is, every time I mention that I work on big cats or that I work in Uttarakhand, this is almost everyone, not just in India, but even outside, because Cobbett has just traveled in so many ways, is going to be like, oh, but have you read Jim Cobbett? Is this like Jim Cobbett? And I want to say upfront, please do not read this book thinking it is anything like any of Cobbett's stories, because it's not. It's actually a very sharp critique of his work. And it is also actually this work is also trying to, and it's not just a critique because of the ways in which many historians have already done this wonderful work of talking about how the hunt was part of the culture of imperialism, how there was sort of this toxic masculinity which you have as part of just the question of the shikar. Those kind of very interesting historical arguments have already been made. What I think I add to this are two things when it comes to Cobbett. One is, and that for me is perhaps the most interesting aspect of this, is the ways in which Cobbett's legacy continues to live on within the local state and among shikaris in Uttarakhand even today. So the ways in which this is not just about, most of it is quite an uncritical reception. It's an uncritical take on him. But even those who are critical of him, they still take on sort of Cobbett and his hunting styles and his way of dealing with man-eaters have become part of the culture of Sarkar. It's sort of part of that Sarkari world in which you think about how do you deal with man-eaters is through almost often not directly with knowledge, but even indirectly through recourse to Cobbett. I talk about how powerful his texts have been. So, for instance, I pick up the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag as one example of one particular text, and I look at how it is so powerful in, say, in Rudraprayag or in areas around it, not just because of the fact that this can be commercialized through the use of, Cobbett memorabilia, Cobbett trails, the safari things that people go on, or Cobbett cafes and cups and T-shirts, and not just that sort of commodification of Cobbett, but actually the ways in which Cobbett then becomes the person you go to understand what it means to live with what he calls man-eaters, and I prefer to call crooked cats for reasons I will just explain. And what I found I've struggled with in a way is getting away from Cobbett's legacy while also being critical of him. It seems like it's almost impossible to do that. And to me, this is also a test to the power of storytelling, because Cobbett wrote really good stories. Many of them are half fiction, but he was a compelling writer, right? And this is why many of us grew up reading Cobbett's work as children, or they were told to us, or in ways that they stay in our bookshelves, our parents refer to them, or anyway. So I'm sort of very interested in the power of his narrative and trying to unsettle it a little bit, a little bit. I'm also sort of the other sort of thing that you encounter if you work especially on big cats is you sort of encounter this very, very powerful wildlife lobby, very, very powerful conservationist lobby. And while on the face of it, you would think that all of us would be very much politically aligned with conservationism. And of course, we all want to protect megafauna or endangered animals. There is also sort of a deep violence to this kind of conservationism and the form it has taken in India in particular. It's exclusivist, it is elite, it is urban based. There's been a lot of wonderful writing out of India and by Indian scholars on actually the problems related to this kind of conservationism. I'm thinking also, of course, of the work of the former director of NMML, Mishra, and sort of the not just the wildlife history, but also the ways in which they've talked about this critique of particular kinds of conservationism. So in that sense, that work has already been done by scholars of South Asia, Indian scholars for me. But I also find it really useful to pick up on that and then think about how do we write about charismatic animals outside this very powerful conservationist impulse, that everything becomes about protecting tigers and leopards, or on the other side, it becomes about pitting it as a debate between, whose life is it that we care more about, the tiger or the leopards. I remember when I started doing my fieldwork, this is something people, not the tiger or the leopards, the humans or the big cats. So I remember when I started my fieldwork, and I still get this even now, people will be like, but you must be, because look at you, you're sort of urban, you speak English, you're coming from Delhi, you must be for the tiger. That is the life that you care most about, right? There were these rhetorical questions that are often asked about whose life is it that the Indian state cares most about? Is it the tiger's life or the leopard's life, or is it the human's life? This is something that comes out in a lot of these sort of narratives on conflict. And again, I found this discourse also something that I found it instructive because it tells you something about the violence of conservationism. It tells you something about the inequalities of lives that sort of come up. But I also found it a very I found it a discourse that I wanted to move away from, because I felt like this is how much of this narrative is also captured, right? So in a way, this book is struggling to escape these two narratives, the Corbett legacy and the conservationist stranglehold on it, and trying to say, can we think about big cats and human relations with big cats outside this? Okay, now the question of why crooked cats. I have to say I haven't written about this enough in the book because I sort of assumed it would be clear. And then now when people read it and they're like, but why is the title Crooked Cats and why do you call them crooked cats? Um, the reason I preferred crooked cats is because this is a way that once, and actually not just once, but quite a few times, people have talked to me about these big cats. So when I would talk to them about, say, a leopard in particular, because this largely deals with leopards in Uttarakhand, though I've done fieldwork in Himachal and Bombay as well, and there are sort of case studies around them in the work. Something that I found compelling was when people would be like, talk to me about these big cats by saying that these are cats that have gone off the simple and straight path to become teda, they become crooked. So literally they say this, ye kuch teda hai. And the question then becomes that why is this individual leopard crooked? Like what is it that has made that individual, not the species, but that individual become crooked? And so this question of what makes a particular individual crooked instead of just being straightforward is something that animates this work. And that is why I prefer the term crooked cats. I think as we know, the way in which you title your work or the names that we use also really structure the story that comes, right? And so for me, this idea of crookedness became something that I wanted to explore through this work. And particularly this question of why do some of them become crooked and not others? And there's a chapter on that, which is called Crooked Becomings, where I talk about the many theories around it. I think the term crooked cat also allows me to sort of move away from what I've just been talking about, which are colonial status and conservationist discourses where the term man-eater is used. I think, and of course, man-eater is also obviously sort of a gender term in terms of talking about men, when most of the victims tend to be women or young children. And I think so. I wanted to sort of escape from this, right? I'm very conscious of the fact that I've just been talking about the things I wanted to escape from, because actually, when you start writing about big cats, it's amazing how structured that field already is for you, and how you can't think outside certain paradigms or certain mode of describing relationships between humans and big cats in India. The subtitle of my talk today, and what I wanted to be the subtitle of the book, but my the press was like, no, you can't have Beastly Tales from India because it sounds like you're talking about a work of fiction instead of an academic work. So I had to have Beastly Encounters in the Anthropocene instead. Though this was my preferred subtitle. This is, of course, as I said, borrowed from Vikram Seth's book of poetry, Beastly Tales from Here and There. I find Beastly Tales interesting for a couple of reasons, partly because this book is about beasts of many types, humans as well as non-human beasts. But the book is also asking this question of who is the real beast of the story, right? And this is something, again, that if I listen to, the interviews or the ethnographic work, this question of who is really to blame here, who is the real beast? Is it that individual leopard, or is it something wider? Is it structures of power? Is it questions of inequality? Is it climate change? Is it these big industrialists who are destroying the Himalaya, who are destroying the ecosystem? Like, what is it? Who's the real beast of the story is something that I want to also play with in this work. And again, I think Beastly Tales also allows me to come back to this question of storytelling and how do we tell particular stories. This links me to the next sort of feature of it. So the framing, sort of, if I can think about it as framing, I frame the book through reference to the Anthropocene. Again, I'm sure most of you know what the Anthropocene is, but just in case you don't, I'm going to very quickly run over what the Anthropocene is, what it means, and I want to particularly talk about how I use the category of the Anthropocene and why I think it might be a productive framing for this work. So the Anthropocene was a term that has been introduced by geologists, so by natural scientists, and Paul Crutzen is widely ascribed as being one of the scientists who sort of came up with it and to describe this particular moment in time that we're living in. The Anthropocene is basically a term that geologists find useful to refer to the fact that human action on the planet is having impacts which are planetary in force. So humans are acting like a geological force, right? It is very useful to think about. The term is useful because it allows us to center the ways in which human activities are changing this world around us, so much so that it is a planetary force. Um, there's so many debates within the natural sciences on Anthropocene on what it means, when you date it, what is the point of it, is it even the right term, etc. I'm not going to go into them here. Neither am I going to go into, I discussed them in the book. Neither am I going to go into the ways in which, the very different ways in which social scientists and humanities scholars have picked up the Anthropocene. There are huge debates within it, and there is no consensus, which I personally find quite productive because it's better to not have consensus on some of these things than to have a slightly flattened out understanding of what something like the Anthropocene is. But I'm going to talk about here very quickly about how I use it and why I use it and why I find the Anthropocene productive as a framing. I think it opens up discussions on the deep damage that has been visited by humans on the planet. I think it also opens out this question of what it means to produce knowledge, a point I've been sort of coming back to. It opens up this question of how we need to have new ways of thinking and of doing academic labor. For me, the reason I found it very useful for this work, and I sort of return to the Anthropocene in it, and I use it as a framing device, is for two reasons. I think the first is that it allows you to put together the social, ecological, biological, historical, and political in ways that have been, I think, hitherto kept apart, right? So if I think of, say, just multi-species ethnography, or I think about, say, animal geography or animal history, for instance, right? These are very powerful subfields within broader disciplines, but they are speaking through certain not narrow, maybe that's not the right word, but they're speaking in a particular way. Whereas what I want to do is open out this debate and actually allow the ecological or the biological to be part of the story, to be sort of woven into it. Again, I don't know how successful I have been in doing it because I found this remarkably hard to do as a narrative strategy and as also an academic intellectual endeavor. But that is something I've tried to do in this work. The other reason I find the Anthropocene useful as a framing is that it allows me to center the climate crisis without reducing everything to climate change. And this is, perhaps we can discuss this a bit more, but I feel like there is also a slight reduction in, there's a reductive aspect of where people will just gesture something and say, well, this is just climate change, we can't do anything about it. In fact, the paper, I was just telling Dr. Mishra, I'd given a early version of this, not this paper, but something that became part of this book at some point, about 6 years back here in this very room. And that paper was called Enter Climate Change. And that paper was really about how the category of climate change was entering Uttarakhand, was entering the Upper Himalaya through particular bureaucratic as well as scientific pathways. And so there is also there is a way in which reducing things to climate change can also be problematic. And that's why I find the Anthropocene useful, because Anthropocene is so much more than the climate crisis, right? It is also a question of knowledge making and knowledge forms. And that's why I find it useful. And hence it's sort of part of it. The question of uncertainty is also something that sort of runs through this work, and you can sort of see it in the way in which it is written, because again, while writing this book, I found it interesting that in all the chapters, by the time I end the chapter, I don't have an answer. I don't have a firm argument. Instead, what I have sort of worked through in all of them is this very speculative, uncertain forms of stories, of theories, of narratives that I find, of case studies, of what I think of as there is this expectation of academic knowledge that you have absolute certainty, you have a particular argument. Like, I compare it to my first book, where in each chapter I had a very sharp argument of, and this is what I say to my students, produce what is your argument. And in my earlier work, it was very easy for me to say, well, not very easy, but I found a way to say that, well, the effects of transparency are counterproductive because it leads to greater forms of opacity, or it leads to particular ways in which the neoliberal state is functioning. I found that I had a narrative which was rooted in particular forms of certain knowledge making. Whereas in this book, what I find is that everything is quite uncertain. Like I'm like, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's this. This one says that theory says that. If we were to listen to biologists, they would say this. But if we sort of looked at it from the perspective of, history, then that is what would come forward, right? And so it's a very speculative form of knowledge making. Now, partly I think this uncertainty that undergirds this work comes from the very nature of my fieldwork. It was, I've used the work I did in 2006, 2008, then again into 2015, 2016. And then I did short sort of field trips here and there, which I've sort of put into it. It's the range of secondary literature. So I've read so much from like science journals, which I never thought I'd do, or wildlife biology journals, which I never thought I would do, especially as an anthropologist, social anthropologist. From history, which of course I'm not a trained historian at all, but I found it impossible to write this without engaging with animal history in particular and environmental history, or from politics, etc. So there's this way in which it's an uncomfortable form of it's a difficult way in which there is a different kinds of sources that I have that I'm working with. But also, I think this comes from the fact that actually the more I explored human non-human relations, it becomes quite clear that formal institutions of governance as well as the conservation actually function through these very uncertain knowledge making practices, that they actually have to pretend to act with certainty in the face of radical uncertainty. Now, this is not just, again, some weakness of institutions of governance in South Asia, but actually, this is, in a way, as we say with the Anthropocene, the defining condition of our times, where we don't know what is to come. And this is not just in terms of the politics or like climate change, but just there is this profound uncertainty that runs through these times, right? And how do we write that in? Again, is something that I found quite useful to think through human non-human relations. So that's a big theme of this. And again, I think that this is something I could do because this was my second book. I think if this is my PhD work, I would not have had the courage to write this because it would never pass examination, perhaps, or it wouldn't pass. It wouldn't be the accepted form of knowledge making. That you actually speak within a discipline in a certain way, or you are writing to an audience in a certain way. So I think there's a bit of that. Again, I've already sort of made this point that I talk a lot about the government of big cats. So I talk a lot about governance structures and cultures of governance. I come back to my earlier work on bureaucracy and process and paper and materiality and affect a lot. I'm very interested in how colonial cultures of hunting, of relations with the non-human continue on in the post-colonial state. Very interestingly, especially when it comes to big cats, and the ways in which they take form in everyday life. Um, I'm also very interested in this question of how, when we now talk about the political or the state, how do we talk about it outside the domain of the climatic? So there's this way in which, if you look at governance or even academic work on government or on sort of on politics and government, there is a way in which it's somehow sequestered from that which you call the climatic or the ecological. And I think I find this distinction unsustainable and perhaps untenable going forward. And then I sort of already sort of mentioned this point quite a few times by now. I'm sort of very, very interested in this question of how do we come to know, to recognize, to live with, to hate, to develop emotions towards a very elusive and sort of already overdetermined non-human animal. And so what I do for this is I use I use all sorts of things, like I use politics of space. I look at visual methods, whether these are like WhatsApp images or Twitter or CCTVs and the ways in which they capture images of big cats. And I also look at biographies. So how is it that you have something like these celebrity animals? So why is it that we all know certain tigers or certain leopards? And what is it that through these biographies of I have, I think, 5 beastly biographies in there of big cats. What is it that we can sort of learn about living with non-humans? I think I might just skip this. This is a question of, this is very much an anthropological question of, what does it mean to do ethnography in this moment? What is the future of the ethnographic method? This is something I'm increasingly getting interested in, and my future work is very much going to be on this question of method within my particular discipline. So yeah, I think I'm gonna end here. And thank you for listening and through this whistle stop tour of the book.
Thank you. You are among the few speakers who don't have to be reminded about time.
Oh yeah, I was
So,
like, I've talked so much about it that I can't talk more.
thank you. Um, we are open for questions and brief comments.
Good question there.
Please go ahead. Use the mic and introduce yourself.
Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Mohini. I'm Professor Nayanika's student in Oxford. My question was actually about your PhD fieldwork because I'm at the stage which you were describing when you started the talk. So I'm curious, it's a little different from the talk you gave, but I'm curious about what your initial question was. You said it was about the politics of the state.
Right.
So what was it that you went in to do and how much did it change when you went and observed what happened around you? So I'm just curious about
Yeah.
that switch when you were in the field.
Thanks.
We'll take up a few questions
Okay.
before
Yes.
you answer.
Yes. I just.
Yes, Riddhi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nanika, for introducing us to your book. And I'm sure we will find more of this in the book as we read it. But just for today, if you could introduce us to one of the explanations that was offered for the crookedness of certain cats and how we can think about it perhaps sociologically or in any disciplinary academic knowledge making form. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, it's so interesting what you're talking about. Like you're saying that there's so many disciplines that you have incorporated. It seems that you were forced to incorporate because you realize, that all these things have to be woven together. As an academic, I increasingly see in my entire time on the planet that we started with these very disjointed sort of specialities, whether in medicine or in academics or in studying the world around us. And now we are realizing that we have to connect the dots. There's an overarching connectedness. So as an academic, how do you see, do you think our education in any way at any stage is moving towards that? And are we going to rethink our, disconnectedness in the name of expertise? Or what do you think is the future? Thank you. Great question.
Yes, please come up. Use the mic. Huh?
Yeah, I had a somewhat related question, which is how do you think your own placement within the discipline, which is a very, particular discipline with a certain formation of South Asian studies, has sort of informed your project and, impacted what you've come up with and how you see it?
Okay.
I think you can answer now.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I didn't get the last two names, but I'll come back to you on that. Hi, Mohini, nice to see you. Thanks for that question. It's a really interesting question, I think, and I think again, as soon as one starts doing any kind of field work, whether you're an anthropologist or just any sort of discipline you're in, whether it's education, etc., we all sort of go in expecting to do something, and then as you do your field work, all sorts of things are sort of revealed to you, or certain doors are slammed shut on your door, face, or some are opened up quite unexpectedly. And then I think the question sort of shifts with that. And I think one of the things that I find most interesting about doing primary fieldwork is actually that it isn't predetermined. What your question might, because we all have to go in with the field with a question, as you know, right? You have to go in and be like, this is what I'm interested in. And then as you start doing fieldwork, especially I think if you do it carefully and if you're attentive to the world around you, and if you have institutional support for being able to shift what your project is, then I do think that that intellectual project changes over time. And sometimes it doesn't. So I've seen some very good PhDs where people have gone and saying, I'm interested in this, and then they just do it and they produce brilliant theses. But I think very often people do come out saying, well, I went in wanting to do this, but actually what I'm really interested in and what my fieldwork threw up was this. And again, we've had these conversations. I think the best research comes out of that, where you follow your nose and then you sort of are able to move around and ask different questions or produce a different project from it. It's in my case, I think what happened was really, and this is why I actually begin every time I talk about this book, I go back to that first month of my PhD fieldwork, because I never was really interested in this question of human animal relations. I wasn't, but I just couldn't look away from it because it was so, especially those 3 months of living in Gopeshwar with that crooked cat reigning over us, ruling over us, terrorizing us. That sort of experience never left me. And then that very uncanny repetition of something like that when I started my fieldwork in Dehradun, sort of pulled me back into it. So there's been quite a bit of writing on serendipity, on the uncanny in the field and how that structures academic work. And yeah, so that was something that was quite central, I think, to this project, and not so much the first project, I think, because then I did have a sense of, I was very interested in understanding how the local state functions and what does it mean to do an ethnography of the state, and I stuck to that and I went through with that. But in this project was not something I'd anticipated. I guess a lot of it also comes, must acknowledge that it's also, I was in a very privileged position by this point. I had a postdoc, I had a job that allowed me to write what I wanted to, right? And I think for me to not, to put that on the table, that this is also a position of privilege where I can be like, I don't care what people in my discipline think. I have a permanent job. I'm going to write what I want. Is something that is also very much part of the second book. Maybe not the first one. Yeah. Thanks. Really, thanks for the question. Yeah. Really, like this whole crooked becomings is a real thing. So perhaps I'll give you one example of a theory that I find quite intriguing and which intersects with different ways of knowledge making, which is something that I know I've talked a lot about without giving any examples in this talk so far. So something that I was told, so Uttarakhand, as you know, as you're also from Uttarakhand, has a very high level of what's called, again, a word I hate, conflict between humans and non-humans, right? And an answer that's often given for this is that, well, it just is like that for historic reasons. And, or people keep asking that why is it that in this particular area, there's such a high level of conflict? I'm very fascinated by the kinds of different theories that were told to me around this, that what is happening in Uttarakhand. So one thing that I was told consistently, and I really do believe this one, is that it actually comes because there's such a high level of hunting here. And the more you hunt a species, the more angry they as a species become with you. So the kin of that species will come and kill you, not you personally, but the other species, which are humans. And this was something I was told by different kinds of people at different times, and it's a consistent one, right? And it good evidence in these places that the more you hunt cougars, the more conflict increases with them, right? So, but there's no sort of rational understanding of why is it that you hunt a leopard and then leopards will come and start hunting humans, right? Because that leopard you've killed is gone. And there were all these sort of different kinds of knowledge forms around this which came up. So if you look at some of the animal history work, so again, if you look at the lions of Gir and when they become animators and when they haven't, it has been linked to some form of violence against them. And then they as a species then turn on you, or it is linked to some sort of natural disaster where they have been struggling to get food, or there's been something that's happened that makes them sort of violent on humans. There was one particular story I remember quite clearly of a woman who would tell me about this one. So it's a long story. So she talks about how she was in the farm, just cutting the grass with a sickle, and then suddenly she accidentally hurt a little leopard cub who was sitting there, and she hurt his foot, and it was a complete accident. But she hurt that leopard quite badly, and so the leopard didn't die or anything, but went off limply. And then she talks about how even now, when she goes to the farm, she sees that this leopard, which is now grown up into a proper big animal, comes and looks at her and threatens her. And she's scared to go into the farms because she's so scared that he will come and attack her. But he never has. But he looks at her and he moves away. And I was like, so why do you think he's never attacked you? But why does he come to threaten you? And she's like, the reason he's not attacked me is because he knows that I didn't mean to hurt him. But had I actually meant to hurt him, as humans do all the time, then he would have come and killed me, or he would have killed my children. He would have hurt someone I cared for because of that. So I think this whole idea of capacity for retribution, of non-human memory, of emotion, of like holding on to sort of particular kinds of stories is again something that we're seeing in a different kinds of bodies of work. On that wider question of violence against a particular species or hurting species in a particular way, there's actually a lot more evidence that's coming out from, say, wildlife biology in India as well. So, for instance, I'm thinking of the work of someone like Vidya Atreya, who's done a lot of work in Maharashtra on translocation of leopards, right? And how translocation means that you capture a problem animal and then you go put it somewhere else, and then in the hope that this animal is now gone from here, so this leopard is out of that space and won't hurt you. But actually what Vidya has shown with the work is actually that these animals the ones who translocate become more and more aggressive. It leads to massive amounts of conflict because they get angry. They try to come back to their own home. These are very territorial animals. They're like cats, basically. They want to get back. In the process, they hurt people. They injure people. So, and they've done this wonderful work in RA in Mumbai around, when is it that you have these massive spurts in conflict or attacks by big cats? And they show that it's linked directly to questions of translocation. Now in India, so far, we don't have the same sort of studies on what hunting is doing. But I'm absolutely convinced that that form of intense hunting that you see in certain parts of Uttarakhand is actually increasing conflict over there. Again, comes back to Corbett, right? And Corbett's legacy, that the way you dealt with this was that you have this native shikari or a white shikari or a native shikari now who model themselves on Corbett, and then they go into what Corbett did. And so you can see that quite starkly in Uttarakhand, even in contrast to Himachal or Maharashtra, where you don't have the same trends. Again, to come back to that question of why in Uttarakhand there's so much conflict, another theory that was told to me quite often was that there's a lot of cross-border poaching of trafficked and killed hunted animals, which goes through Uttarakhand. So they go via Nepal to China and to sort of Southeast Asia, that market, because of that open border. And again, people are convinced that because of that border location, as the space through which these trafficked, injured animals are going, these big cats are becoming, as a species, are becoming angry at humans, right? And I find all of these very compelling, and they all sort of intersect with different forms of knowing, the different kinds of theories and studies on them that come there. In Kenya, there's been a lot of work actually again on hunting and on translocation, which again shows that the more you try to control or hurt big cats, the more it leads to forms of, well, what they call conflict and what I call crookedness in some ways happening. So perhaps that's one example of the crookedness and how that comes out, and I think it is also, I hope, an example of why the idea of crookedness is perhaps more interesting here, because it's opening up who the actors are here, right? It's not just that leopard or the tiger, or even just the hunter or that Sarkari official who's signing off on that hunting permit or who's doing something there. That you have this range of historical political actors on that ground who are then leading to some form of disequilibrium within it. And of course, there's a broader theory. I mean, I'll stop at this one because we've got more questions, but there's a broader theory that the destruction of the Himalaya through, intense deforestation, through intense industrialization, damming of rivers, this, horrific big infrastructure projects that we're seeing, which are just, it's actually so painful to watch, right? So the thing that is leading to so much anger amongst leopards and tigers as species against humans, because they're destroying the habitat and destroying their the prey base, the natural prey base is sort of dying with it. Of course, we have extinction of so many species, which were the regular prey base of the cats in the mountains, is also part of it. So they all sort of come together to form the story of crookedness within it.
There was one more question.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Charu. Okay, hi. Charu. Yeah, that's a really great question, I think, that you asked, and a really big and a really important question on sort of connectedness, right? And how, and you're absolutely right. Like, even when I teach right now, we teach our students through disciplines, through areas, through methods, right? That this is the method you follow and this is the way you do it. Now, I personally think that disciplinary training or that area training is very important because I think it, we were discussing this just before this, that you can't just wake up one morning and be a historian or be an anthropologist or be a South Asianist. You need to actually do that labor, and all these disciplines have their own, or these ways of social science disciplines have their own ways of understanding the world. But I also think that more and more we are moving towards this wider question of, as you so nicely put it, connectedness, right? That you can't actually sequester off this from that. So you can't take history away from anthropology or politics from ecology, and you have to find ways to make them work together. I think we're seeing this in pedagogical form. So, again, we were talking before this, where you have these liberal arts degrees, where you have the option of taking different kinds of projects. And again, if I can come back to some of my own interests of this book, for instance, that's why I find something like the Anthropocene productive, because I think that Anthropocene opens out that possibility of saying that actually I will engage with geology, and I will also engage with ethnography, and I will say that these knowledge forms need to be in conversation with one another. And I don't have to be a geologist to do that. I don't have to be a historian to do that, but I can try to use these knowledge forms together to talk about the connectedness of the world. I also genuinely think that the climate crisis does change things. Like Naomi Klein's polemical book, this changes everything. And I sort of believe that I do think it changes everything, and including how we teach, how we write, how we produce knowledge. Yeah, so I would basically say I agree with precisely what you said, that we've all trained in these very narrow ways, but I think it's important to open it out. Thank you for that. Sorry, I didn't get your name as well.
Angad.
Hi, Ayanda. Thanks for that question. So if I understood your question correctly, you were asking about my position within the discipline of anthropology or within South Asian studies. So again, I think that's a really interesting question for me to also think about, because before I was always in an anthropology department, and I was very much in conversation just with anthropology as a discipline. I did my master's here at D School, and I did my MPhil and PhD in anthropology, and then I did postdocs where I was very much within a anthro world. And then when I got this current job that I have, I also had a cross upon with South Asian studies, and I think that really helped shift the final form this work took on, because then I had to teach, and things which frankly I didn't know much about at that point, but I had to suddenly get up to speed with South Asian politics of a form that I didn't myself know till a few years back. And I think that push to engage with different disciplines or with the region through a South Asian studies perspective also really helped me, because it helped me understand that this is something that is peculiar and specific to South Asia, but also has more sort of global resonances within it. I think it also sort of helps if a point I think I've already made, which is that even within anthropology as a discipline, there are ways in which anthropologists are realizing that they can no longer just talk to themselves, or they can no longer just have these very narrow disciplinary conversations, but they need to have broader conversations. In a funny way, with anthropology, they used to have them like that, right? So anthropology as a discipline, when it first came out, when we talk about someone like Margaret Mead or Malinowski, the early, our so-called four fathers and four mothers, they were very much in engagement with what's called the four-field approach of different fields within it, or with different, this wrote for more popular audiences. They engage across the natural sciences, social sciences in ways that somehow the discipline then became more and more specialized. To go back to Charu's point, where we became more and more experts in one subfield, and moved away from this broader, more encompassing understanding of the discipline. I think there is a way in which that is also being questioned again. So I also think disciplines have their lives where you suddenly go down this very narrow path and then you open it up again. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Any other questions? Yes, please go ahead.
Um, Thank you, ma'am, for your very informative presentation. Ma'am, you just mentioned of this culture of hunting the wild. So my question to you would be that, can you just highlight a little bit on the genesis of hunting initially only the wild animals? Secondly, I would want to ask you that hunting has been a part of colonial wild, cultures. So has this hunting the wild made these cat family, such as the crooked cat or let's say the tigers, as celebrity animals? And my second question to you would be, can you please give me some ideas on how to write, how this climate crisis writing? I would want to know a little bit on that. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, please come up and use the mic. Please sit and ask. Sure. Thank you.
I am Prakash from India Climate Justice Collective. Will you please elaborate on the connection that you want to establish between planetary crisis like climate crisis and tiger conservation?
Any other question? Yes. Yes, please come up. Use the mic.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor, for that talk. My name is Kunal. I'm a grad student in anthropology at Johns Hopkins. So a lot of, I think to begin with, thank you for answering Mohini's question in the way that you did, because I'm currently doing ethnographic fieldwork in Allahabad, and I went to study the Ganga, but now I'm studying pilgrimage ledgers. So it's, it's heartening to hear that this is normal.
We all do that.
But I think my question is basically to ask you to elaborate on your last slide a little more, and like ethnographic futures, because I think this is a sort of a twofold question. I mean, one, you already answered part of it when you answered Charu's question, but I think, I mean, A is like the kind of disciplinary promiscuity that we're engaged. I mean, I find, and so like, how do we think of the canon, for instance, going forward?
Right.
I'm reading a lot of Indology now, being completely unprepared for it, but finding great sustenance in it for my given my field side. B, I mean, specifically with regard to the Anthropocene, like addressing what, say, someone like Timothy Morton has called the hyper objects of that we're dealing with today, or yeah, so just that. I mean, how do we think of anthropology in the future? I mean, and we already have some examples. So your last book, I'm sure this book, Bhrigupati Singh's Poverty and the Quest for Life, there is a way in which, so we have examples. I mean, your essay called On the Task of the Climate Translator. So there are ways in which, but like, I mean, so the challenge to that, I mean, or the pushback that I'd like to give is like, there's a lot of work that we're producing as anthropologists, as academics, but to what extent, and you mentioned, I'm sorry, this is long-winded, but you mentioned that, say, Malinowski was writing public-facing text, and like, 2 years ago, we saw the kind of damage that COVID did. Any sociologist or urban sociologist worth their salt could have said that, this lockdown is an absurd idea, hang on. Right. But obviously, there is this knowledge that we've been producing for decades, which is not, in some sense, being translated as it were.
Please
so,
conclude.
I'm sorry, thank you. Yeah, that is the question.
Yes, there was one question from there.
Hi, Nainika.
Hi,
It's nice to
Andres.
see you again. My question is similar to one of the earlier questions, but I'm fascinated by colonial understandings and I guess the colonial imposition of how we understand terms like big cats or beastly cats or man-eaters, and also colonial impositions of governance, because we have inherited, the civil services from the British, and we've also inherited how we understand animals and, these big cats from the British. And I guess there's been some change under Indira Gandhi about preserving the tiger, save the tiger. But how important is that colonial understanding in your work? And, do you see it being replicated, in your interviews, in your ethnography? How important is it? Thank you.
Thanks, Aryan. Yeah,
I think you can answer that.
yeah. So I didn't get your name, or I missed it. Karishma, yeah. So, okay, so Karishma, your question, maybe what I'll do, you had a few questions in there. I think what I'll do is I'll pick up a question. We're talking about climate crisis writing, and that also comes back to some point the Kunal made, and actually even links to a bit of what Aryan was saying. Now, within the climate crisis, there's a whole, well, not within the climate crisis, there is actually a genre, if you can call it that, of climate crisis writing that is emerging at this point, where every sort of discipline, whether it's in the humanities or social sciences, is finding or is trying to find ways to write the climate crisis in particular ways. So if I could give you an example from anthropology, which is a discipline I know the best, and within that, this question of storytelling has been one way in which people have been writing about the climate crisis. And it's an interesting sort of a tool because, of course, anthropologists have always been telling stories, right? Like they've always been storytellers. So in what way does climate change then make you, storytellers of a new form is a question that's being asked. So there's a way in which people say indigenous voices are being talked about through the kinds of stories they talk about their relationship with nature. So say with a disappearing river or the relationship to land or how you sort of work within it. There's also a way in which there's been a move towards different kinds of writing as well as an incorporation of other disciplines. So perhaps an example I can give you of someone who would be familiar here would be someone like, say, Amitav Ghosh, right, who is doing what we can say a particular kind of storytelling around the climate crisis. He had this polemical book called The Great Derangement, where he said within English literature or within fiction, there's been a big problem because they haven't been able to write the climate crisis in. That the story of the climate crisis has been so big and so sort of unthinkable, as he put it, that a lot of fiction in the 20th and 21st century wrote it out completely. And he makes this call for new forms of storytelling or climate crisis writing. And he himself has then written, this novel called Gun Island, where he's attempting something like that. He himself has this other very popular sort of history book called Nutmeg's Curse, where he's writing in a way in which the story is not just about nutmeg and colonialism, but also about how colonialism then leads to something like climate change. So he's attempting something like that in a more popular way. But within the discipline, say again, within different disciplines, there have been moves to write the climate crisis in. I should say I'm actually this is exactly what I'm interested in myself now. I'm going to be on a 1-year fellowship in the States, where the theme of this fellowship is called Climate Crisis Politics. And there are going to be about 25 of us who are all sort of thinking about what is it that the climate crisis does to things like method and to writing forms, etc. So this is very much where I also want to take it. So your question um, is something that actually links to my current and future research in ways. I think what I would say is that there isn't an answer here, right? That these are experimental forms of trying to understand the past and the present and the future. And there isn't a specific answer that we can provide here, but it's all quite experimental. Now, within this question of climate crisis writing, you have history is actually very important, and especially the question of empire and colonialism is something that is very important to it. Because one of the critiques that have been made is that in the story of climate change, in the story of the ecological collapse, what is central to it is colonialism, right? And how imperial practices have actually led to this horrific state that we're in. And that's often sort of not acknowledged as deeply as it should be. So in my own work, when I talk about big cats and I talk about the hunting practices, I talk about them in two ways. One is I talk about how we can't understand extinction or endangerment today without thinking of the massive amount of hunting and culling of wild animals that happened under the British Raj. It is impossible to think of it outside that particular history of extermination of non-human animals, especially, you know, tigers with the whole shikar as well as etc. And the other way I think about it is in the ways in which these cultures of hunting persist in the present. So to go back to Aryan's point as well, right? In what ways can we think about, why is it that a response to a crooked cat is that we hunt it down immediately? Why are there no other ways that we can think about living with this beast, right? Or trying to understand why this is happening. But why is that an answer? And then not just why is that an answer, but also the way in which it happens, right? So the machans you put up, the kind of way you wear your get a rifle, the clothes you wear, the masculinity of the shikari, you know, the way in which they model themselves, the way they talk about what they're doing. These are deeply colonial endeavors, right? The ways in which they say, I'm a modern day Jim Corbett, I'm a mini Corbett. You know, the ways in which the Shikar diaries are sort of gestured to, even some of the images I showed here, like that image of the Shikari with those men of state standing next to him with the corpse of the leopard, that is also a colonial image, right?
Ma'am, is it because of the, out of this safety concern that they wanted to hunt the wild? Or is it because they wanted to show this toxic masculinity of, that we have hunted the wild, which is not easy to get? That is what I was.
So they're both there, right? So the you can't. I mean, they're not. The both of those are there. So part of it is a show exhibition. It's a status display of conquering the wild, so to say, and of also saying that look, now you can relax because the state has done its job, and here's the corpse of the crooked cat for all of you to behold. But it is also part of a older visual vocabulary we have of understanding. Right, like we've all seen those images of like viceroy standing with a foot on a tiger, and you know that whole thing. So we can't disassociate these separate things within it. So they're all part of it, if that makes sense. This partly I think answers your question as well, but I'll come back to what you also said. We can talk a bit more about it. There are a lot of things in your question. So on the one hand, we have the climate crisis and how we write that. On the other hand, we have the question of history and how history is written into this, particularly through the question of the hunt, right? So we'll talk a bit more about it, yeah. Sorry, was your name Prakash? Yes, thank you for that question. So the relationship between planetary crisis and tiger conservation, right? So I can say this in two, I can answer your question in two ways. I can answer your question from the position of a tiger conservationist and what they would say to your question. So a tiger conservationist would say that the planetary crisis comes into the imminent extinction of tigers, because we have biodiversity depletion, we have, the landscapes are being effaced, jungles are being cut down. We see this, think of the film Sherni and, think of what was happening there, etc. And this is all part of a kind of ecological attack on the planet, which we see in localized forms in India or in the area we're living in, that are making life difficult for tigers, that is leading to the endangerment, that has made them endangered and could lead to extinction. So there's a very straight line that something like the World Wildlife Fund or Save the Tigers, etc., that they would draw between the planetary crisis and tiger conservation. And that's one answer one could give. What I am trying to do here is something slightly different. which is to say that I center the planetary crisis and I say we can't understand the phenomenon of crooked cats outside the planetary crisis, but I don't draw the straight line between them. So I don't see a causality in the same way that a conservationist would. Rather, I try to center questions of history, of power, of politics, of state forms, of masculinity, of gender, of inequality in trying to understand and the violence of conservationism. So I'm actually quite critical of the way in which tiger conservationism is happening in India. And I find it quite a, and again, it's not me, this is not me speaking. There's a wonderful body of work written by scholars well before me on the violence of conservationism in India, which I lean on quite heavily to sort of understand that. So there are many ways to tell this. And what I'm trying to do it is I'm telling it in a bit, if I could use the phrase crooked manner, right? I'm not doing a straight line there. I'm sort of coming around, dancing around that way. Thanks. Then Kunal, I think I had your question on future of ethnography and the canon, etc. I mean, these are great questions, and I mean, we should definitely talk more. This is exactly what, as I said, this is exactly what my future research is on, and I recently gave a talk at LSE, which was actually on this, like what does Anthropocene do to anthropology, and how do we sort of think of someone like Malinowski, and we think of the canon, and we think about how we need to sort of reinvent that in this moment to think about ethnography and how ethnography has a future and what ways does it have it. But as I said, I have no answers to this. This is exactly what I'm wrestling with myself and I plan to work on in the future. So we should talk a bit more about it. But you raised lots of many really important points. So thank you for raising that. Yeah, but we should talk more maybe.
Ji, please go ahead. Use the mic. Here is the last question.
Yeah, we are talking of extinction of this tiger. Can we use this in vitro fertilization also in this case?
Yes, it has been used there have been lots of sort of tiger breeding programs. It is being used quite a bit, I think. It's not that successful as a process because I think it is a hard process, like captive breeding is not very easy, but there have been quite a few of them.
But they say it cannot be a natural way because they live in climate is different, environment different. But in case of this is not a natural way of life. This is not
exactly. Yeah. Absolutely right. And it's quite violent to them in many ways. Yeah, absolutely.
I think there are no further questions.
Oh, it's okay. Otherwise, I'll just take 5 minutes, to understand. Because you.
Can we come to you later?
Yeah,
I just
sure,
had
sure.
something of my own.
Carry on.
Thank you for this very interesting lecture. One thing that I wanted to point out was that this idea of masculinity being associated with hunting is not at all a colonial idea, nor is it a modern idea at all. As we know, and as an anthropologist, you know it much better than others, that humans and the big cats, part of their evolutionary trajectory coincided. So they developed a certain kind of relationship with each other. In the last, say, 500,000 years. So it is inbuilt in human history and in human mind that if you hunt down the big cats and also other big animals, it shows your prowess. This discourse, this narrative has always been there throughout history. The colonial powers of Europe simply adopted it because they were the dominant masculinity in the 19th century. So they wanted to suppress the colonized people's masculinities. And therefore, they showed themselves as the super masculine. But the discourse by itself is not something which we can call colonial or toxic colonial masculinity. I'm reminded of so many examples of this kind. Right here in Dimurti, we have Shikargah of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, one of the great rulers of Delhi.
Yeah.
And you know what was the custom of hunting at that time? The kings, etc., they used to hunt in such large groups, and they used to hunt for days and weeks sometimes. And one reason, it is said by the chroniclers of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, that one reason they went on hunting was to keep their army fit. and to prevent their soldiers from doing any facade. That's the word used. Fitna or facade, in order to avoid these kind of activities, because they thought that there was too much masculinity around. So let's exhaust their energy by taking them on hunt. And this Shikarga was right here. It's a beautiful structure, and you find similar things in all parts of India and all parts of the. I understand. I'm just saying. So all parts of the world, The other, you see, and there are so many examples of that kind. I don't know. You might have heard that the great Afghan ruler, he got the name Sher Khan because he had killed a lion with one stroke of his sword. So again, he got that title Sher Khan from his master, and later when he became the king, also he simply changed the Khan to Shah, which means king. But otherwise, he kept that idea that he had killed a lion with one stroke of his sword. So that was there. But on the other hand, historically, we also had in India, and I believe in other parts of the world, that other relationship, which is the relationship that conservationists more or less have, that affectionate relationship, the relationship of concern, which this humans always had with animals, and especially with big cats and with bears and with so many. I don't know, you probably would not know, but Nazir Akbarabadi wrote a great poem in 18th century on a small bear cub that he found on the way, and he brought it home, and he brought it up, and he has written a poem celebrating the life of that bear cub. It's, yeah, beautiful. So both kinds of relationships existed in history. What I wanted to say was that from the 19th century onward, as the Europeans were able to conquer and dominate the world, they brought all that together, and that is very typically expressed in the novels of, say, somebody like H. Rider Haggard. So you find that colonial figure. Here you talk about Jim Corbett, but there you see, in the case of Africa, his great novels like, that one, She, and the other one which talks about, I'm forgetting the famous one, uh, the the European hunter coming and then taking some natives and hunting elephants and hunting big cats, and also sort of in a way establishing the superiority and the power of the white races among the non-white races. They picked it up and they brought it together in a superb manner. So there is that complexity there, which I'm sure you know about it, but I would like you to take note of. Uh, Another thing that is important here is that, of course, you mentioned Anthropocene, and as far as I understand as a layman, Anthropocene is the era in which human activities have had a defining impact on the planet. So they have deeply influenced and they have changed the course of. But then the last 100, 200 years, they are but a very small part of the Anthropocene, isn't it? And as an anthropologist, you will take a very long term view of how these things have changed. You mentioned North America, and you also talked about how the stories of crookedness, one story, one example you cited. I would just add to what you said. You see, in the case of North America, again, we had similar stories about why animals become crooked. So, in the 16th century, when the Europeans reached there in North America and they started killing big animals, of course, no lions and tigers there, but beaver was the main animal that they started hunting. So, when they started hunting these animals in large numbers, very soon they found that there was, among the natives, there was a lot of resistance. And the natives' point of view was that they have some kind of a covenant with the animals, that they will hunt only up to a certain level, but not beyond that. So their hunting was not meant for the large scale colonial exploitation of furs and other animal products, which the Europeans were trying to do. So after 100 years or so, the native Amerindians like the Iroquois and the Hurons and many others, they started saying that the covenant between the human souls and the animal souls has been broken by the white man, because they are hunting large scale for this purpose, and now therefore the animals have become aggressive and they are attacking us in turn. Because earlier we were doing hunting as part of a compact or a convention which did not actually hurt the animals to any large scale, but now it is happening. And therefore, so I believe that in native societies all over the world, these kind of ideas, and by the way, I'm not questioning the native wisdom, probably there is truth in these things, because as I said, humans and big cats, they evolved, they had a certain deterrence for each other, and probably there is some truth in this. We don't know, we can't say, like you said, that we don't have answers. So we really don't know whether there is some truth in this, that animals are becoming aggressive because as we are sort of making their lives more and more difficult, it's their way of pushing back. Maybe, we don't know really. So that's it, I think. If
Thank
you
you so much.
want to say anything.
Well, I mean, I would say, yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I at no point was implying that it's only a colonial masculinity. Of course, colonial forms of hunting took on Mughal practices and more indigenous practices of hunting. But I was specifically talking about Corbett, and I was specifically talking about the ways in which the post-colonial state carries on some of the legacies of the colonial state when it comes to managing big cats. So yeah, that point is taken. And you're absolutely right about historical examples from North America of the relations with other kinds of animals. You're also absolutely right that at the same time as we have these sort of hunting practices, we also have more indigenous forms of what we can perhaps call conservation, but about more tender forms of care towards non-human animals that have existed, and which are also very complex and historically specific. So yeah, I would agree with all the points you made.
Thank you. There was one last, if you permit.
Sure,
Just
yeah.
small thing,
But
if you
please
have the
keep it
time.
brief.
Yeah. So, because you've interacted with the bureaucracy which deals with issues which I really think that I go by what you're saying. We really really need to keep looking at the colonial structures that we've incorporated in every small and big thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I'm going to say something very sacrilegious.
Yes.
What do you think is the role of local rural government? From my just my observation, I feel sometimes that maybe it has become easier to exploit the smallest hamlet, mountains in Himachal and Uttarakhand because of the local governance. That could be one thing which could be said and would be really sacrilegious. So, what has been your experience when you've dealt with the bureaucracy?
I found the local, again, my experience largely from Uttarakhand, and I have to say the local sort of governance things when it comes to big cats, they actually don't have much power because it comes under the forest department. So it's actually deeply centralized. It goes back to the Wildlife Protection Act and the ways in which animals come under Schedule 1, etc. So they don't have much of a say in this particular aspect. Yeah. I mean, I think they are quite in other forms. You're right. Ecologically, I think that my experience again in Uttarakhand is that they're quite weak, and they are very much they don't function in that independent way that you think they would, that they're supposed to. And actually, they're quite. It's hard for them to not understand it. Exactly, especially the pressure of say exactly, yeah, and even district level governments, when you think of these big industrial projects that are coming in, or these big infrastructure projects, you think of these dams, you think of these industries. I think none of them can. This is at a much higher level. So there's almost no way in which they can withstand it, even if they wanted to. Now the question is, do they want to or not is another one. But I don't think that they have either the institutional or the social power to stand up to that, unfortunately. Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're right, but I think it's more because the powers that be sort of are mandating forms of what they call development, which is nothing short of ecocide in the Himalaya, which I see that my observation, only observation, not practically, is that it becomes so much faster than erosion. Yeah. Because forget the big things that you love, the small things. Like somebody wants to make a one-story building within a village, right. Yeah. It's so much easier to approach the village government. And mean, again, from Dehradun, one can see that, you know, it's pretty shocking what's happening there. And I haven't done this research, I have to say, so I don't know if I can answer this. Unfortunately, I haven't done this work, yeah. But yeah.
We'll carry on this discussion.
Yes, thank you
It's
very
an
much.
interesting subject, and I believe everybody has lots of questions. So
Yeah.
I'm sure that you will be surrounded by questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nayanika.
Thank you all.